Hi. Hello everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Team Fonseca has joined already. Angela. Hello. Let's give everybody a little bit of time to join in. Sorry if I'm 3 minutes late. Hello Ellen. Lovely to see you. Elise. Brioni. Hi, is everybody? Beautiful weather, isn't it? Yes. I've been to the park earlier. I don't know if you can see the slight blush. Hello Martina. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining for another Instagram live out of lockdown, and I'm super excited about today. For the ones who don't know me, my name is Jan Konetzki. I am in my normal life the director of wine at 10 Trinity Square. It's 10 Trinity Square in London, close to the Tower, is a home to a beautiful Four Seasons hotel, a 2-star Michelin restaurant called La Dame de Pique in collaboration with the great chef Anne-Sophie Pique. I'm also overlooking the wines for our Japanese and Chinese restaurant called Mei Yu Mei, and of course the private club on the second floor, where we have a very special collaboration with Chateau Latour and Artemis Domain. And because being at home, being in lockdown, it is very, very hard to keep in touch with people, and hence why I get everybody together to talk about wines, and wines I'm really passionate about. For example, port wine. The ones who know me and the ones who met me in person know that I'm a massive, massive lover of port wine. So that's why I think that port wine is actually one of the best wines made in the world. It's definitely one of the most artisanal. If you think about the many steps from where the grapes are grown to the fortification, the winemaking, the aging, the blending, it's such a lot that goes into making port wine. Hence why I'm really excited to talk to somebody who is legendary in the world of port wine. I'm talking to David Guimaraens, who is the technical director and head winemaker, not only for Fonseca, one of my favorites, but also for the Taylor Flatgate Partnership Estates. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. Then, if you have been working with me, or if you have been to the restaurants where I pick the wines, there is, since I think over a decade, Fonseca 20-year-old Tawny in 1985 vintage by the glass. I might be a bit boring, but that are just some wines which always deliver over the top for me. And I am looking forward to talk to David about the 20-year-old, for example, a little bit later. Great. Port wine, for the ones of you who don't know, comes obviously from Portugal and is made on the UNESCO World Heritage side of the Douro Valley. It's a super dramatic scenery dominated by the schist terraces and a place of pure natural beauty. Obviously, it all goes down to Porto and Vila Nova de Gaia, which are the facing cities, which are the capitals of port wine. Super, super enchanting, hilly cities with great people, fantastic food, and of course great wines. So, am I boring, Alan? Please don't tell me I'm boring. So, if you haven't been to Porto and Vila Nova de Gaia, you must visit. And of course, maybe Alan can help you with a visit to any of the Fonseca or Taylor Flatgate partnership wineries. Good. Let's see if David is online already with his team. If you guys have any questions, please ask away. There's a little question function just down there, where you can put your questions. Then they pop up, and I will ask the question to David, or I will answer them myself. So many nice faces. Hello, Nicolas here, Miguel is here. Great to see you, James. Hello.
Hi, Jan. How are you?
I'm very good, David. How are you?
I can't wait to pour myself a glass of port.
Oh, I'm with you. I'm with you on that. I've tasted mine already, but I haven't poured myself a glass of port yet. Where are you?
I'm in the middle of the port lodges here in Villanova de Gaia, and I have an aversion over the last couple of months. I've done a number of different interviews, or this is my first Instagram interview, but I refuse to do it in my office. It is a really boring place. So I come here into the lodge, and it's much more pleasant.
It looks like a brilliant place to give an interview. I do not know how the weather is in Porto at the moment. In London, we are still in lockdown, but the weather is beautiful. It's 22 degrees. It's mild, a little bit windy, so it's outside is quite nice. But it's promising at some stage to be a nice summer, hopefully. How is life for you at the moment in Portugal?
Well, things at the moment are good. I think Portugal has been remarkable throughout this whole extraordinary experience, event, whatever you want to call it, because ourselves, like the whole of the world, has been assisting to what's been happening in different countries. And Portugal, I think through a number of combinations from the discipline of the Portuguese people, the way we organize ourselves, and who knows if there's any other factor, we have been remarkably untouched, all in relative terms. And so we're in our third week since the country has been opening up, and we're all watching very carefully to see what's happening. And fortunately, things are going remarkably well. Here in Porto itself, for the last 3 days, there have been no new cases, and so that's a good sign.
That's very good news. We can cheer to that later on when we have our first port wine in the glass. You are the technical director and the head winemaker. That's a massive title. I mean, I have a quite big title with director of wine and ambassador on both, but that's a big title. But before we talk about your responsibilities, I'm always because I'm very passionate about port wine, and I talk about it quite a bit. I think there are a lot of terminologies, and because Portugal is around for so many hundreds of years, that people don't know. And do you want to take just a split second to explain the Flatgate partnership, so people can understand how that works together?
Well, first of all, it's great that you share the passion in port. That's certainly my passion. And when we talk about the Flatgate partnership, it describes basically ourselves as a family company, and the Flatgate partnership is a family holding company under which we have our three main port houses, Taylor, Flatgate, and Yateman, Fonseca, Guimaraens, and Croft Port. And that's exactly what we are. We are these three families who have these wonderful, wonderful port houses. Each port house has got its own history, its own identity. So under the Flatgate Partnership umbrella, we continue to preserve what gives the identity and individuality of each of these three wonderful port houses. We'll talk about that a bit later. And sorry to complete that, my name is David Fonseca Guimaraens. I'm sixth generation of the Guimaraens family. My ancestor was Portuguese, so that's why this is a wonderfully unpronounceable Portuguese name. My ancestor, Manuel Pedro, he joined Mr. Fonseca back in 1818, 2 years after he started trading. But it was after the 1840s forward that my ancestor took lead of the Guimaraens family. But because Guimaraens is such an unpronounceable name, we've always kept Fonseca as our trading brand.
Yes, there is something there's something to be said, and I mean I'm a foreigner working and living in the UK, and and port wine is something which I connected technically even more in the same way with the UK as I do with Portugal, and obviously a name which is not easy to pronounce to the British tongue is not always a great sales point. But yes, I have to say I had Brioni from Menzendorf also pronouncing it a couple of times, so I get it right when I say it.
Just think about Guimaraens, makers of wines. Well said.
I mean, you gave a little glimpse in the history already, but maybe we can talk a little bit about your job as technical director and head winemaker first. I mean, it sounds like an insane amount of work you have. But if we talk, I had a little look at the responsibilities that they put forward to about you that you have, and the first thing that was written there really scared me, because the first thing was you are responsible for the inventory of all the port wines, and I said, like, well,
all these wonderful barrels behind me.
That's a massive responsibility in the world of a sommelier. The inventory day is the day that everybody dares, because it's you have to write everything on a piece of paper and then send it off to the accountants team. By the way, our accountant is watching, so that's
careful what I say.
He still keeps an eye on me. But to be serious, I mean, there are the responsibilities that you have. I mean, as a head winemaker, so that's the vinicultural and fermenting aspects of things. But can you speak a little bit about the job to understand better what you do?
Well, I probably, if I may, I'd probably like to bring port into the context of the world of wine, which is very important. And that will also help to understand what the role of a head winemaker, whatever title you want to give it, is involved. But when you think about port, you think about a fortified wine. And port is within the category, the family of fortified wines, which have their origins to the addition of wine spirit to raise the alcohol level, to make these wines more stable to travel. But this also makes the category of fortified wines which have this extraordinary ability to develop over time. And so in the port industry, and when you think about a port winemaker, the first thing that you've got to do is relate a port winemaker to any other winemaker in the world of wine, and where we share the many skills, beginning with viticulture and vinification, and then the preparing the wine for bottlings. What does a port winemaker have different to a table winemaker? Noise there.
It's working. Your work is a working place.
Port, as I said, port being as a fortified wine has this extraordinary capacity to age. So the barrels that you're looking at behind me is part of the port stocks, which we age for many years in wood. And so this is where another skill comes in, which is the art of the blender, to take care of the port stocks during their periods of aging to develop one of the styles of port that we'll be talking about in a minute. So myself as technical director basically is my board position, which means the buck starts with me in terms of technically. But what I really am is a winemaker. And as a winemaker, I work with this magnificent team of viticulturists in the running of our vineyards to the build up to the harvest. When it comes to the harvest, we have the winemaking period itself, where we're transforming the grapes into a young fortified wine, and then all of the dynamics, which again we'll be coming to that in more detail a bit later, of the making of a young port. And then the next stage is taking care of the inventory, taking care of the stocks of port as they age in our cellars to the point that they're ready for drinking, and that's working with the blenders. Because in port, you have the skill of the viticulturalist, you have the skill of the winemaker, and you have the skill of the blender. The blender, you think of in the Scotch whiskey, for example, the whiskey blender. It's exactly the same thing. It's the person who takes care of the stocks to blend to a house style. And that's where the wonderful complexity, which makes people like you, Jan, passionate about port. The more you get to understand port, the more you fall in love with it.
And I think that part of a style, and I think the blending process, it's something, again, you have to visit Porto and Vila Nova de Gaia to understand that better, to see the barrels, how they age, and to get an idea about what a blender needs to keep an eye on, to have an understanding which level is which stock in, when will there be, when they will need wrecking, which style will they develop into. It's incredibly interesting, and really another thing that I think that sets ports wine very much apart. I always think about some of the most artisanal wines for me in the world, the ones where the most human touch has the biggest impact, is port wine and champagne. But even with champagne, where many times the winemaker will also be the blender, in port wine, it's very interesting that they relate, but it's a complete profession on their own, because the stock management and the work that you guys do are many times overspends a generation, or at least many decades. And I think many people don't think about that aspect when it comes down to the blending.
You say that, Jan. For example, with a 40-year-old port, in fact, very timely date for this chat here on Instagram. This year I'm celebrating my 30th year since I came back home. And only now are the ports that I made 30 years ago starting to be used in the 30-year-old Tawny blend. And I'm still working with ports that my father left me generation beforehand to make the 40-year-old. So yes, as you say, when we're managing stocks, we are accompanying these ports as they age to then, in decades or even for the next generation, to be ready for drinking. And that's very much the world of the Tawny ports. When you're talking about the vintage ports, it's the skill of understanding what does a young port today that's going to be bottled when it's young, how will that have the capacity?
Sorry, I was just cut out for a second.
We're back on.
That's the beautiful of a live that's the beauty of a live recording. I hope my sound is a little bit better now.
I'm sure that wasn't a signal that I was talking too much, was it, Jan?
No, it was no sign. It was not signed for. It was not that. But I literally lost you when you spoke about how to understand the vintage, and I just.
Well, with to age, whereas a Tawny port, we will accompany these ports in the barrel as they age for their lifetime. With a vintage port, our skill when we're blending a young vintage port, just to make it clear, the vintage port will be bottled 2 years after it's made.
Yep.
Then the vintage ports are the ports which have this extraordinary ability to age for 50, 60, 80 years in the bottle, and the aging will happen in the bottle. Because the aging happens in the bottle, you have one chance to get it right. Because once it's bottled, if it goes wrong, you'll have egg on your face for a generation or two.
For generations, because they're around for some time, aren't they?
That's right.
That's the other thing. I think from I think it's a very important thing to because many times people, especially if they're new to port wine, or even if they say, oh, I like a glass of port wine, and you ask, oh, do you like a ruby or tawny style? It's something which is which many times people can't answer if they're new to port. And I think I explained that many times in the restaurant, that it'd be quite interesting if you had a couple of sentences to tell people, okay, this is a ruby style and this is a tawny style. Would there be a brief way for you to saying what to expect between, or what's the big difference?
Well, I can't resist. I put some port in my glass.
I will join you.
It's always much easier to talk with something in front of you.
Yep.
And yeah, and yes, I think the biggest challenge that we have in the port trade and this is a challenge that we've had since the beginning of time, is to get the consumer to be familiar with port wine and the styles of port that we produce. Because I normally say that all of us grow up knowing what table wine is. It's either white or red, it's from this region or from that region, it's from this grape variety to that grape variety. But the world doesn't have to, or the world of wine doesn't have to be constantly educating the consumer to say, what is the difference between a white wine and a red wine? That is general knowledge. But when we come to port, you really have to break down port in two very distinct families. The ports, which I like to call the full-bodied, the fruity ports, which are from the ruby, the reserve rubies, the LBVs, and the vintage. These are the ports, and why do I call it full-bodied? Full-bodied, the name says everything. It's full, it's rich, it's fruity, and that is exactly the style of port which you can imagine enjoying with what for us are the perfect combinations. And again, here we're talking about port as a dessert wine. We're talking about a full-bodied port, like exactly the bottle that you held up in front of you, the Fonseca Bin 27. This is a 2.5-year-old premium ruby port, where you have heaps of fruit, you have got lots of structure, and still plenty of fresh, vibrant tannin. So can you imagine if you had in front of you a chocolate cake, a really delicious chocolate cake with that rich power? Well, when you take this very full-bodied ruby port with all its tannin and richness, that is going to cleanse the palate after your chocolate. It's going to have the intensity to balance the strong flavors of chocolate, but it will cleanse your palate and it'll just make you go back for another glass. And that, when you're talking about food pairing, very much the importance of the sommelier, of the suggestion of saying, what will go well with this chocolate cake? Well, look at this Bin 27. Or also, cheese. Cheese is a delicious thing to snack on, but it's also very intense. And we do know many people like enjoying a red wine, probably younger red wine, because of the tannin. Well, a young full-bodied port, Bin 27, a late bottle vintage, and why not a young vintage port? A young vintage port is a super ruby port. That combination is perfect. So if you put the full-bodied ports as fruit, richness, intensity, you then have the other family of port, which are the tawny ports. And here I have the Fonseca 20-year-old tawny. And whereas ruby is perfect to describe red and full-bodied, tawny, and particularly if you're coming from the English language, tawny is brown.
Yes.
Brown means oxidative aging. So if you take a young ruby port with fruit and color, you age it in one of these big barrels here behind me, and you age it for many years in these barrels. And when you look at these barrels, they look very dark color. This is old, very old seasoned wood, because what the barrel is doing, it is giving you a contact with oxygen, so that over time, the young fruity, the young ruby red will get transformed into this very rich, tawny, brown nuttiness. Here you get dried fruit aromas, which is a transformation of fruit, ruby to tawny. Again, as they age in these barrels, we lose 2% of evaporation per year. So for this 20-year-old tawny, over 20 years of aging, 2% a year, what happens? It drops out the tannin, so it becomes soft and smooth. It goes from ruby to tawny, it becomes brown, dried fruit aromas, nuttiness. And as it evaporates, it concentrates, so it becomes sweeter. And the tawny ports are the best lubricant of the conversation in the world. And tawny port, particularly if you remember to just keep the temperature down a bit, chill it a bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. We need to many times strong to warm.
The tawny ports, I also, I call the tawny ports the no-brainers. They're no-brainers because you drink them because they taste good. And we're all wine lovers here, I imagine, on this story, on this Instagram. But as wine lovers, we have moments where the dedication is the glass in front of you. But we all, however big a wine lover we are, we have moments where we don't really give a damn what's in the glass. We just want some good company, or you want a good lubricant of the conversation. You take a 20-year-old tawny port with the richness and the smoothness. And there's only one problem. If you're with a group of friends, you'll never stop chatting. You'll just keep chatting and chatting away. But tawny ports are also a really good combination as a dessert with your egg-based desserts. So your egg-based desserts are rich, they're creamy, they're soft. If you have a full-bodied fruity tannic port, that's going to overcome your egg, your custards, your sponge cake. So your tawny ports, that smoothness is so well matching. And the no-brainers, the no-brainer is also because they're easy and approachable. They're just so easy to fall in love with. I'm not saying that none of you listeners have got no brain, but there are moments in life where we want to take off our brain. And so a tawny port is a great no-brainer just to drink to relax.
I can also, I mean, there are so many great and fully agreements that about the things that you've said, but also tawny port is a very, obviously from the restaurant perspective, a great wine for many restaurants, because it is an oxidative style, so it has that kind of nutty aromatics that you described, and also they keep very well, and you don't have to worry about a couple of days of keeping them open. You said that was a very long answer to a very short question, but because all of these things are great, and especially I'm always smiling when somebody says in Portugal egg-based dessert, because everybody who's been to Portugal who knows like 95% of all desserts in Portugal are egg-based, and for sommeliers, many egg-based desserts could be something, a custard-based, like a crème brûlée, for example, where especially with the caramel layers on top, tawny port is a fantastic and natural match. There is, we might go back to talk about the wines in a second, a little bit more in detail, but Portugal for me is also always the Douro Valley, and those amazing, dramatic, scenic terraces. And maybe can you say a few words about the viticulture for Fonseca and for you? Because I know that there've been the Douro is obviously the Douro since a couple of million years, but maybe how much the Douro means to the style of port.
Yeah, you mentioned something which was really interesting earlier, and I think your listeners can relate to this. And you made a comparison which I use all the time, which was between port wine and champagne. And here you were talking about blenders. However, you've hit the spot. And what do you have in common between port and champagne? Champagne is a region which traditionally had difficulty in ripening its grapes, a very natural high acidity. And it was in the development of a style of wine, a sparkling wine, that you made the most perfect wine for those natural conditions. You have the non-vintage champagne through the art of the blender. You can blend across different years to create the most balanced wine. And you have your vintage champagne in the years where nature gives you the perfect balance. Let's go to the other extreme of the wine world, port and the Douro Valley. The Douro Valley is a region of mountain viticulture in hot climates. In the Douro Valley, we have extreme conditions of heat, of dryness, and the issue in the Douro Valley is ripening our grapes to a very high sugar level. In fact, much higher than you normally want for a still wine. And it was through the creation of port wine that through the use of spirit to make this fortified wine, you have a style of wine where the extra balance of the alcohol gives us this extraordinary capacity to age. You hold on to the sweetness in port is the natural sugar of the grape. So for us, we want that sweetness. And here you get in a vintage port. The vintage port is only bottled when the year's perfect, like a vintage champagne, the very good years. And these are perfect ports where we can bottle them young and they will age in the bottle. The tawny ports is we can take ports, varying ports, through the aging in wood, through the art of the blender, you can transform them into the most perfect drinking ports, which are the aged tawnies. And so the Douro Valley is this very, very dramatic region because it really is mountain. And Jan, you've been to the Douro many a time. We're talking about vineyards perched on the side of the slope. So my job in viticulture is probably one of my most challenging jobs because there it's how to cultivate these vines in this region of extreme conditions.
Yeah. Yes, it is a region of extreme conditions, and again, the champagne reference somehow waves in the back because I know that you work and all port houses work with a lot of grower families. Some of them only bring a couple of kilos, and some of them supply thousands of kilos of grapes to you. And again, that's a nod to the kind of history of port wine, which always fascinates me, that these structures are so ingrown into the land and into the people for generations after generations. You spoke earlier about that you had your 30th vintage because I think you came back from Australia in 1990, and then if we talk about important years for you, I mean, there are maybe for port wine lovers quite great vintages. I mean, let's not get into the word great vintages because it is something, the greatness of a vintage is sometimes misperceived from people who drink it. But maybe I can ask you, what are the important vintages for you in the last 30 years that really meant a lot to you? Maybe not because they were the best, but maybe because they were special because of other reasons.
Well, when we talk about vintage port, every bottle of vintage port is a time capsule. And in this time capsule, which is a bottle of vintage, you will capture a number of things. One of them is that you will capture, for a Fonseca vintage port, you will capture the character of the wines produced from the Fonseca vineyards. Again, when Jan talked about the Douro Valley and the characteristics, being a region of mountain viticulture, this magical concept of terroir really comes to this enormous expression in the Douro Valley. Because in mountain viticulture, whether you're a south-facing vineyard, north-facing vineyard, whether your vineyards are lower down, whether they're higher up, where they are within the region, you get very different profiles of wine. And so the vintage port will capture the character of the vineyards, and the Fonseca vintage will be very much a style relating to its own vineyards. Number two is vintage port will capture the character of the year that it's grown in. So here we have a 2004 vintage, and every growing season has its own characteristics. You have cooler years, wetter years, hotter years, and that is also very different. And then, so inevitably, And when I look back at my 30 harvests that I've made, I do not have 2 years which are identical. I have years which are similar, but they are not identical. And here is very much what vintage port is about. Vintage port is for the wine enthusiast. It's for that consumer who wants to discover, you want to discover the style of the vineyards, you want to discover the style of the year. In fact, I have this saying, which is, through drinking wine, you can travel the world through trying different wines from different regions. And at the moment, Jan, in this very appropriate time that we are locked into our own localities, you can keep traveling by discovering different wines and especially different ports. So yes, when I look back over the last 30 years, we have this thing that vintage port, we will single out the extraordinary years to declare as a classic. Inevitably, some years stand out in your mind. 1994 is one. And 1994, I was very recent back home, so I came back home in 1990. You got to remember, we're a port house with 200 years of history. You have a family culture in the company. So you don't have one guy who's the brainchild of everything. No, I work with a lot of very skilled, very knowledgeable people where port is in our veins, and you have a company know-how. Yes, I can take that team off in the right direction or the wrong direction, so I do have responsibilities. But when I came back home in 1994, it was a very, very memorable moment, and the 94s were incredibly well received. But then, yes, I do have other years. 2003. 2003 was the year of the canicule in Bordeaux, and just when Bordeaux thought they were going to have to start changing to make fortified wines because it was so. 2003 was an extraordinary year for port, and the 2003 Fonseca's for me, wow. Inevitably, when I'm declaring a vintage, I will relate back to the vintages made by previous generations. Yeah. And for me, the 03s remind me of the 66s, an incredible year. Very hot year, and very often the hot years don't show as much when they're young, but they live and they live and they live. And I think, 03 is fantastic. And, there are other great years, 2000, 2007, but then let's come more recently. And 2011 Fonseca is also one that will stay in my mind. And very interesting year. It was a year that fairly balanced growing season, not too hot. But then in September, when the harvest came, we had a heat wave where if you were not on your toes, you missed the boat. And we were chasing to get the grapes in before they went to the point of overripeness. And the quality of the 11s, the structure, the longevity show that we were there right. So inevitably, as a winemaker, inevitably with vintage port, each one is one of your own children. Each one will have its own character and personality. Then we will follow them as they grow up. Yeah. And inevitably, some will behave very well, some will behave less well. But the secret to having a reputation is to make sure that you take the right decision frequently enough that you'll gain the respect of the consumer and the trust.
That's I think that what you said and what you finished with is I think very big words which are very important, because as you said earlier, I really understand, like, you're the 6th generation Fonseca Guimaraens coming to and I just can I'm just for a moment just imagine how that would be, being coming back from experiences on the other side of the planet, living a quite different life, and coming back home and finding your feet, and then obviously 30 years later, I'm sure that's it's obviously 30 years. But I think it must have been a very interesting, humbling experience to do that. Just as we've been, one thing is, was it always clear for you since you were born that you would go back to become a winemaker, or were there?
I'll try to make a very long story short. My first harvest I did when I was 8 years old, and you got to remember something which is probably not familiar to all of you followers, listeners, is that the port trade is one of the few, if not the only, wine trade where the location of the port houses where the aging is done is physically separated to where the vineyards and the wineries are. And the reason for that is that to go from here, Villanova de Gaia, to the Douro wine region, there's a big mountain range. And for most of our history, that mountain range was a physical barrier. Was a physical barrier to get to the Douro Valley. And when I came back home from Australia in 1990, it still used to take 3.5 hours drive to get there. So when I was 8, the drive was even longer. My for 2 weeks to spend a harvest at Quinta Terra Feita, which is one of the Taylor's vineyards. And he left me there living with a farm manager. It was absolutely magical. And I got hooked then. Then, like in the good old British tradition, I got packed off to boarding school in England at the age of 11. And when I finished school at the age of 18, I still had the interest and memories of my early days in the Douro. But it was in 1985 when my father gave me a one-way ticket to Australia and a number of contacts in the wine industry that I experienced a harvest in the region of Rutherglen in northeast Victoria. And that's where I came to the conclusion that this is what I wanted. But it's quite interesting. The reason for going to Australia is that if you go back to the now distant years of the 1980s, that was the beginning of the New World, and the Old World regions of Europe were very much resting on their laurels that we made the best wines in the world, which was true for our high end, but the commodity wines in Europe were basically, as the Australians would say, crap. And my father had a lot of vision, and by sending me to the New World, he went to see, he showed me a part of the world where they didn't have the top end, but their commercial level wines were very good.
Yeah.
Here you've got to remember that Portugal and the Douro Valley is a region of a lot of history, very labor-intensive vineyards, very labor-intensive winemaking, but we had to reinvent ourselves. Labor was becoming more expensive, labor was getting scarce, and we had to reinvent ourselves. So by going to Australia, I went to see the other extreme. So I came back in 1990, and it has been the most extraordinary period of the history of port to live through and to work through.
It's I'm sure, and especially, I mean, I've been to Rutherglen, yes. And even if you go now to Rutherglen is the neck of the it's the neck of the woods. I mean, that's
interesting point, Jan. Pre-1980s, Australia used to be a country where 80% of Australian wines were fortified.
Yes.
And not many people know that. And extraordinary fortified wines, great port styles, great sherry styles. They made, and they still do, make some fabulous fortified wines.
It is something which is, we all know that, I mean, the things we do are down to fashion in the world of wine. For us as sommeliers, there are fashions, there are things we like and things we enjoy, but also then, and because the people's taste is impacted by fashions. And it's so interesting that the beauty of a port wine is that its fortification, its power, its intensity, and its sweetness, which is balancing all that, and that's why it's great wine pairing. And in the past, sweetness was something which was valued higher than anything. And now we are living in a world where we're looking at the wines which are drunk at the tables are many times lighter wines. But back in the past, the most expensive wines and the most savored wines were sweet wines and fortified wines.
Sorry, Jan, I beg to put some small thing in here, which is in North America, a lot of red wines are being bottled with 15, 20 grams of residual sugar. They call them dry. They have 15, 20 grams. So the consumer very often likes to think dry, but drink sweet. And they're almost embarrassed to drink sweet because, oh, it's going to wet my finger. Bullshit. Sorry, let me keep my language clean here. Got my Australian side coming out here. That is true. Is fashions are right, but sweetness never went out of fashion. But there is the right moment to enjoy the sweetness, and that's where Jan very much so, as a sommelier, to guide the consumer when is the right moment to drink a port. That is so important. If you're going to drink a sweet port with your main course, probably venison is one of the few courses that I would even bother doing it. Other than that, I drink a properly dry red wine. But yes, don't be afraid of the sweetness in port.
I'm absolutely not afraid of it, and just to hang on to that, I always say about that many people like to say that they drink dry wine, but in the bottle has to be something which has a touch of sweetness. It's a mental boundary, but absolutely right. I mean, dealing with you must be dealing with sommeliers for all the time that you've been working, and I have a team of 9 sommeliers that I overlook, and many people have been working with me over the years, and it's many times. The perception and the reality are 2 different things, and I think it's good to be aware of them and to talk about them. I'm just a little bit wary about that. We only have 10 minutes, and we haven't been speaking about the wines so far so much. I mean, the 20-year-old Tawny we have briefly touched on when we explained the differences between Ruby and Tawny Port, and I always explain in brief words to guests at the table. The first thing that they need to think about is a ruby port. You call them the powerful ports. I call them the ports which are in the direction of a red wine because they are fruit forward. They have this flavor profile of dark forest fruit and have that slight sweetness. And a great port in that style has tannin, but also has a great freshness. And that's something which comes, I always explain, from that schistous terraces of the Douro Valley. It's not a natural high acidity, but you have that there, and together with the sweetness and the tannin, that gives the tension into a ruby port for me. And a tawny port, which lives not only from the blending, but also from the oxidative aspect of something which you call, say, that it's reduced the from the oxidative part of aging, and the nutty, for many people, brandy-esque aromatics of caramel, hazelnuts, treacle are for me things which are great to enjoy with food, but also, as you said, great enjoyed as they're on their own. I had a very brief stint where I worked with a Portuguese sommelier. His name is João Pires. João was the last head sommelier I had before I became head sommelier myself. And it's very interesting from somebody who is Portuguese to be educated in very, very straight words about how port wine works and which port wine to serve and not. And I never argued with him about any of it. And one of the first wine that he said, like, okay, this goes on the wine list, and even if I'm not here anymore, that stays literally on the wine list. So if you just can say maybe a few words to really make people understand what is the fantastic thing about the 20-year-old Tawny that you make.
Right. Okay. we are running out of time, so a number of key things. One of them is please, please, please. We're talking about port wine, so use a wine glass. Half of the pleasure of drinking wine is sticking your nose in it, the aromas. So rule number one, don't use some stupid piddly glass for port. Use a wine glass, a white wine glass. Rule number one. Rule number two, the tawny ports, because they've had this oxidative aging, they're very rich, they're very smooth, chill them. Bring down the temperature. We're coming into the warm months. I know you've had a warm spring. Hopefully you'll have a good summer as well. But I set you the challenge. Grab a bottle of Fonseca 20-year-old, put it in the fridge door on a warm summer evening with a group of friends. Just don't stick port into those brackets of the special occasion, the winter. You're going to lose enjoyment in life.
You'll miss out.
You'll miss out. So grab a 20-year-old tawny with this richness, this softness. It is so good to enjoy on its own. Again, Jan, you mentioned this works very well for the restaurants. These have got a stopper cork. When you have a bottle port with a stopper cork, what we're saying is we've done the aging in wood, and it will last very well in bottle open for 2 or 3 weeks. Now, I dare you to have a bottle open for that long, because when
never happens, not in my house.
I had actually drank a bottle last night. It was so hot here. It was 29 degrees at 9 o'clock at night. We had dinner outside with some close family, and I brought a bottle of 20-year-old, it disappeared. So that's where the tawnies are just absolutely easy to enjoy. You mentioned, and we talked about the Bin 27, the fruit, very good description, berry fruit. Again, another rule in sweet wines. They should taste sweet but finish dry. There is nothing worse in a sweet wine than that word cloying. Cloying, stickies. Stickies is a disgusting word. And if anybody thinks one of my ports is sticky, I would say that I've failed with my work. And as you said, Jan, the tannin balances the sweetness, but also the spirit. Being a fortified wine, port is 20% alcohol. So if you think that most red wines nowadays all around 14, 15% alcohol, it's not that much more. 20% alcohol, that spirit is also going there to balance your sweetness. So the Bin 27, it's fruit, it's chocolate, it's cheese. Bin 27 is not dated, it's blended, so it's always the same. And very good value for money, one to have on the sideboard, also with the driven cork. When you get home in the evening, you've had a bad day with your boss, pour yourself a glass of port and get the enjoyment out of it. So, and I'm pushing along here because I'm aware we're running out of time.
Yes, and while we're pouring ourselves hopefully a glass of the 2004 vintage Guimaraens, there is Elise who asked a question very early on about serving temperature. And I am absolutely with you. Our port wine is kept is kept at the temperature of a Burgundy, of a red Burgundy. So at a restaurant, we serve it somewhere between 14 and 16 degrees. And because again, many people don't understand the power of a temperature of wine. And the power is a little chill integrates the sweetness, lifts the freshness, and also the aromatics. You don't smell the spirit part of the wine anymore. You smell the fruit and the vibrancy of it. And again, the other important thing is a great port wine finishes dry. So you have that sensation that you like to go back to the glass. And in the restaurant world, we want that people drink more. I mean, we don't want to. Well, of course.
So we're finishing with the 2004 Guimaraens Port, and this is where we place Vintage Port as the port for the wine appreciator. And it's good to have good to have a minimum knowledge of what vintage port is, because a vintage port is bottled 2 years after it's made. So it's a young port, and a vintage port is expected to live in the bottle for a generation at least. So it is bottled with a wine cork because it is going to continue aging in the bottle. And that means that a vintage port will have different characteristics depending at what age you drink it. And there is no rule as to when you should drink a vintage port. That's also very important. Some people say vintage port is there to be drunk when I'm 50, when it's 20 or 40 years old. Wrong. Vintage port, you will get different enjoyments at different levels. A young vintage port, if you imagine, if you're going to be bottling something to be drunk in 40, 50, 60 years time, it's got to be perfect when it's bottled. So a young bottled vintage port between 2 to 8 years of age, is what I call a perfect ruby port. It is the perfect Bin 27. In fact, when my father started Bin 27 in 1970, he wanted to put the taste of a young vintage port for day-to-day drinking. So a young vintage port is the maximum expression of fruit. Yes, it will have a lot of tannin, but it will be an extraordinary combination with chocolate, with cheese, and you get great enjoyment out of it. Then another very important thing with vintage port, as your vintage port ages, because it's very fruity and tannic when it's young, it will throw a sediment. So as a vintage port gets older, you want to decant it off its sediment. And that's the only reason. Decant it, you'll get it off its sediment. But if you're used to aging your own red wines, you need to do that anyhow. And so vintage port then, between 8 and 16 years of age, what you have there is you still have obviously a lot of fruit, but then you start getting your spiciness of bottle age. With this 04 now, you start getting what is, there's one thing in life that we cannot replace, which is time. Probably just as well, but unfortunately for other reasons. But it is only the age of time in the bottle that you'll develop this bottle complexity. And that's why we sell vintage port when we bottle on release, but we also release vintage ports that already had 10, 15 years of aging cellars, so that you can find exactly something which has got some of that spiciness. And in that 8 to 18, 16 years of age, you'll have that youthful fruit, but spiciness. Then your vintage port will go through another phase from about 20 to 40 years of age. That's where your spiciness, your bottle age character starts dominating and your fruit starts subsiding. Then past 40 years of age, and please, ladies, excuse the expression, this is where you separate the men from the boys. Only really the great ports will keep on aging from 40 years forward, the great vintage ports. And after 40 years of age, they become incredibly complex, incredibly fine. And that's what vintage port can do. Great enjoyment. And that's why I said earlier, it is something to, you open a bottle of vintage when you've got a group of friends who enjoy wine. But another key message I like to leave here, if that's my last one, is don't keep your best bottles of port for the special occasion. The occasion will be more important than the bottle. So because in life, we need to create many special occasions, open a bottle of vintage port and create a special occasion. And you can do that and get a lot of much better moments in life. And that's what vintage port can do for you.
I couldn't agree more. Beautiful closing words. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. In 30 minutes, we're going to be chopped off from Instagram. It was lovely to meet you over the screen, and I'm sure on my next visit to Porto, we will find a moment to share a glass of port.